We're on session 2, making a people of His own. In our last session, we discussed the dynamics of our covenant-making Jehovah and what being in covenant relationship with Him means. God was not caught unawares when sin and rebellion entered creation. By establishing the interwoven covenants, God was bringing salvation to the whole of mankind, enabling them to enter eternity. So when all the things that happened with Lucifer and the snake getting into the garden, God knew exactly what was going to happen. He was already prepared. We explored the first covenant between God and mankind made before the fall in the Garden of Eden. And that was the first covenant that showed God's ultimate purposes for the whole of the human race. Next, we introduced Jehovah's agreement with Adam and Eve as mankind entered an age of conscience, learning to judge right from wrong, although God did not want them to, but they chose this path anyhow. In this session, we'll see God's covenant establishing the right of human government with Noah. Next, Abraham's covenant with Jehovah God begins an age of promise, looking forward in time to that group of people who would choose to be His own. Remember, that's one of the themes that are throughout the whole of history with God. He's after a people who chooses to be His own. Trish just brought my notes in. Owen, can you do that for me? Just bring them up here. So that's been part of God's whole purpose with human beings, is to find a people, a covenant of His own, that would keep the covenant with Him. So we'll begin with the covenant between God and Noah. Any questions on the first covenant that we went through? You had a little bit of homework that you could have done. Anybody get a chance to do that? We kind of did it all together. Did you have any more thoughts that we didn't talk about in class? On the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Or the biblical timeline from Adam to Noah?
Can I just say on that biblical timeline, I don't know if anybody else heard it on the news the other morning.
Yes?
They now think that Aboriginals have only been in Australia 8,000 years.
That what has only been in Australia? Aboriginals have only been in Australia 8,000 years. They're always re-estimating their figures and working it through.
I just thought that was really interesting in the context of your timeline.
Yes, so it would have taken human beings that long to spread down to Australia. And then, of course, crossing the land bridge when Australia was still enough connected to the Australasian continents. So 8,000 years. Yep.
I thought it was very interesting, Susan, that never been brought to my mind before, but to think they were all alive, you just sort of assume they died off because we're only brothers still there.
Yep. But great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Adam would have been there sitting around the fire at night, telling all the young ones as they came through about what happened with Adam and Eve in the garden, and hopefully teaching some of them. Well, certainly, as we'll see, the godly line that came through Seth, he would have taught those God's principles and God's relationship and to be true with God. Because it was through Seth, remember, that Enoch was, he was in that line. And who was Enoch? Come on, you Bible scholars. He pleased God so much that he was not. So God just took him home. And there's a possibility in Revelation, it talks about 2 witnesses that come back to life. And the 2 people that have never died in the Bible history are Enoch and Elijah. Interesting. So the Great Flood happened 2,300 BC. So it's not, when you start getting the time frame in your mind, it's not that long ago. So it's not millions and millions of years. One of the things that we want to do for the workshop with this session is to get in touch with I was going to bring in the Creation magazine tonight too. I'll go and do that over the break. Is to get in touch with the creation science people and see if we can have a speaker come and talk about the difference between creation and evolution. It should be really interesting. We'll probably open it up to the whole church if we can do that. Good. Okay, so we're up to page 1 of session 1, the covenant between Noah and God. Setting the scene for God's choice of Noah. Number one, continuing the story of mankind. Continuing the story of mankind. Genesis 4 displays the sorry state of independent mankind with Cain. We know the story that Cain killed his brother Abel because he was jealous that Abel had a relationship that Abel kept God's covenants when it came to presenting a sacrifice and Cain didn't. Then during the next 1,000 years, other sons and daughters were born to Adam and Eve, and the human race spread across the face of the known world at that time. Now, it probably only was just around wherever the Garden of Eden is. There's a lot of controversy among some Bible scholars as to where the Garden of Eden actually was. Some people believe that it was what is now the Sahara Desert. Some people believe that it was up closer into Arabia. So they don't know exactly where the Garden of Eden was. There's some hints about the river Euphrates and gives some boundary lines, so they have a vague idea. And if it is in the middle of this Sahara Desert, it would have given Satan great pleasure to have so totally destroyed the Garden of Eden that it would be just desert today. So they began to spread across the face of the known world. So Eve and Adam had lots of sons and daughters. A lot of people say, well, who did Cain marry? And it was because Adam and Eve would have had sons and daughters, and then the next generation that came along, to start with, they would have intermarried. But because they were such a pure gene race, such a pure gene pool, it wouldn't have caused any inbred qualities where down through the generations when it came along long before, probably during Abraham and Isaac, they were told not to intermarry anymore. Because if you intermarry too closely, what happens? So the children are deformed. So with Adam and Eve, they would have been still a pure gene pool, so they wouldn't have deformities in their race. Although the other theory is that that's where some of the deformities in the human race would have started, is way back there. Two main family trees can be traced from Adam's offspring. Through Cain, murder and violence produced generations of godless men. Then human girls interbred with the sons of men in Genesis 6:1-2. Producing offspring from this intercourse. Some people say that it was either because they intermarried with some of the evil angels around, so there was actually a mixing between Lucifer's, Satan's forces that fell from heaven, and women, or it could have been mixing with Seth's line, so that people from Cain's line mixed with Seth's line. But evidently it produced a generation of giants, of huge people. It's interesting when you start thinking about some of the threads of where then did some of the Greek mythology come from with all their gods and their, whether it came back from some of these stories with the sons of men and the daughters of men and the sons of God intermixing. The second line through Seth, where generations of godly parents taught their children the requirements of Jehovah, producing men like Enoch, Methuselah, and eventually Noah. To such godly people, God committed His sacred scriptures, probably by oral tradition, because it wasn't until historians tell us that there was a certain date when they actually began to make written records. So they would have had papyrus reeds, and they began to make paper. So to start with, they would have had an oral history passed down from generation to generation until they learned how to make paper and began to writing down the history. 2, the foundations of all covenants. From the covenant with Adam, we can see at least 5 major building blocks God would use in future covenants to further cement His plans for the future of mankind. And remember, that's one of the things that we're looking for when we study the covenants, is how each covenant builds on the next one, that builds on the next one, that builds on the next one. And eventually it builds into the new covenant with Jesus, and then to the everlasting covenant. So God is building that whole process of bringing mankind back to Himself through the covenants. So from Noah's covenant, or from Adam's covenant, we can see there's 5 basic blocks. Genesis is the beginning book and has the beginnings of all doctrines in it. So here are 5 major themes that we can pick up from all the different covenants. First one is a sacrificial system was established. An animal's life was sacrificed so that God could exchange it for Adam and Eve's life. The animals, their sin and disobedience deserved death. The dead animal skin provided a covering and protection for them, replacing the self-effort and the guilt of fig leaves. So here's one of the themes that comes down all the way from Adam and Eve. Certainly when we get into Moses' covenant, we can see how the old argument of law versus grace just becomes so strong. So way back here, a sacrificial system was developed. So the beginnings of this system. So God provided for them a covering, the skins of the animal, rather than what they had provided for themselves was the fig leaves. Second, in the story about the garden, God establishes the reality of Satan and his evil methods. We are also introduced to the coming judgment on Satan. So right from the first, God talks about and establishes that there is an enemy of mankind, but that enemy has been judged, certainly in the last days. Then the third major theme that comes through that we can see from Adam's covenant is a prediction about the coming rescuer of mankind. The Messiah was given. Jesus was the one who would restore mankind to Jehovah. So the whole theme of the Messiah, each of the covenants will pick that up and build on it. Next, God established the right to set limits on man's destructive abilities. He separated them from the tree of life so that they wouldn't live forever in their sin. Under Noah's covenant, how did he establish that boundary line with the wickedness of the people? The great flood. That's right. So God has kept the right all down through the generations to set limits on the evil of mankind.
So Susan, if they got in and were able to eat from the tree of life, that means the world would have stayed this way forever.
And you would have been around Adam and Noah, and you would have seen all the patriarchs. Because they would have lived forever. But then so would Mussolini, so would Hitler, so would, and imagine the horrificness of babies being born into the world that was so corrupt. People could live forever. So they could do anything that they wanted. There was absolutely no penalty for sin. They could have lived forever. That'd be pretty horrific. So yes, that's one of the reasons why God put them out of the garden.
I'm glad.
So are all of us. Yeah. And then the fifth stream that comes in, and it isn't so strong in the other covenants, but it lays a basic foundation in the covenant with Adam and Eve. God gave his observations on conflicts, whether gender, tribal, or national. He revealed the cause and the results of curses, such as the cycle of domination between the sexes. And we talked about that was one of the results of the sin that Adam and Eve, the curse between males and females. And that's exactly what it is a curse. Happens generation after generation after generation. You only have to pick up some of the more humorous emails and see how it's still slanted, the males against the females, the conflict of the sexes down through the generation. So God made his observations and his comments on how to protect females. And down through the generations, have women been very well protected? No. So God made his observations about conflicts. Number 3, the scene for the Noahic covenant. So what was the scene? What was the story when God began the covenant with Noah? As the story continues in Genesis 6 to 10, the earth became filled with violence and wickedness. In fact, the Lord was grieved that he had made man on earth, and his heart was filled with pain. Now, it's interesting, there's probably an unstated view that God doesn't show his emotions, and therefore God isn't touched by human emotions. What do you think? It's very much touched. Here you can see grief, pain, just sadness, because he knew what man was capable of, and humans had fallen to this level. So Jehovah begins to plan the destruction of all the wicked through a universal flood that would cover the earth. And of course, that's another one of the controversies in the evolution versus creation. Some people believe it was only a local flood, so it just happened around where Noah lived, nowhere else. What's the evidence to suggest that that is not true?
The whole world was flooded.
The Bible says it, yeah, but you can still go back, and some people can manage to pull it apart and say, well, it's just a local flood. How do we know it was a worldwide flood?
Because a large part of the land is on the sea,
Mm-hmm.
and there's fossils and all sorts of things to give evidence.
Yes. So in fact, a lot of the things that scientists have found, all of these fossils all over the earth, are an evidence that the flood happened all over the earth. You remember we haven't gotten to it, but Noah's surprise when he drank grape juice after the flood, what happened? It was fermented. Now, if it was just a local flood, then that region in wherever he was, Mount Ararat, would have had fermented juice. The rest of the world wouldn't have. It doesn't work that way. Fermentation has happened all over the earth. Rain has happened all over the earth instead of just mist that happened in the Garden of Eden. So there's lots of evidence to point that it was a worldwide flood. It wasn't just a local little spot around where Noah was. Then we talked about climate changes. After the flood, this is where mountains and valleys and oceans were set, the limits. But we'll get into that in just a minute. So, the scene. As with most of the covenants, God approached one godly man to share his covenant. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. We can only guess an overwhelming awe Noah felt when God, the Jehovah Elohim of creation, approached him. I don't know if any of you have heard the tapes by Cosby. What's Bill Cosby on the creation and Noah? And anybody heard those? He goes into the most funny story about all the different animals coming to Noah and what Noah said about him, and it's just so humorous. If you ever get a chance to hear it, it's Bill Cosby, and he does such a funny comedian role anyhow. But he talks about all the animals coming to Noah, and Noah having to sort out which animals stayed with which animals, and it just goes on and on and on. And then Noah's wife and all her comments about, yeah, but I don't have room to bring in my clothes, and I don't have room, and here you got all this straw, and what are we going to do with the camels? And it just goes on and on and on and on. It's very funny.
Is that audio too?
Now, I think it actually probably was a record at one time, so it's gone to an audio now. So if you run across it, let me know, and I'll share it with the class, because it was just so funny. And then, of course, all the sound effects with the thunder and the door shutting, and that was just really funny. Okay, God instructed Noah to build an ark. And actually it was about half the size of a modern ocean liner. So it wasn't just a little tiny dinky big boat. It's about half the size of an ocean liner. Then God brought 7 of every clean animal, a male and its mate, on board, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, plus 7 pairs of every kind of bird. Original kinds were not necessary, what we find today. So he didn't have to bring a pair of German Shepherds, a pair of Labrador Retrievers, a pair of Siamese cats, and so he could bring 1 pair of cats, 1 pair of dogs, 1 pair of horses, 1 pair of all the different animals. And it's interesting that actually God brought the animals to Noah. And that was part of Bill Cosby's funny story, too, of Noah going out and trying to find these animals. And God said, hey, wait a minute, Noah, I'm going to bring him to him. And then Noah was just so relieved that as God began to bring him all the different animals. Room was provided for his wife, each son and a wife, 8 people in all, plus enough provisions to feed them all. And then God shut him in. So that would have been a huge project just to get all the animals in and in their right places, and not to have big squawking conflict between the animals. But remember, up to this point, the animals knew dread of human beings, but they weren't fearful of them like what they are today. And we'll see that that's one of the consequences of the flood. Then, for the first time ever, proper rain began to fall, and it kept on falling for 40 days. And it wasn't just the light stuff that we've had these last couple of days. It rained, and it rained. 100.
This year I started doing the people of the Bible, so when you see.
Yes?
And for the first time ever I realised that the waters gushed up from under the earth.
Yes, that's true. So the fountains of the earth broke loose as well, and they came up as well as came down. That's true, Jan.
When God stopped the rain, He also stopped the waters from under.
So there must have been huge caverns underneath the earth's surfaces where the mist would have come up to water the earth. And those huge caverns, well, they're probably still there today, and that's the water tables that we see around the continent. So the rain fell for 40 days. 150 days later, the water began to recede. 150 days. How many months is that? About 3 months. If it's 30 days in a month, about 3 months later. Whoops, hang on. 30 into 150. About 6 months later. 6 months, and they aren't over yet. On the 27th day of the second month of Noah's 101st year, notice he's not just a spring chicken here either. He's 601 years old. About 365 days after the rain began, they left the ark and stepped on dry land. Isn't that amazing? Almost a year they would have been inside the ark.
Oh, I was just thinking I wouldn't have a shower or anything.
Plus all the animals.
Plus,
And
where do they go to the toilet? Oh, God, I'm just picturing it now. Oh,
yeah, well, you're on Bill Cosby's line, because that just went on and on and on about every day they had to go out and scoop up all this poop and all that poop, and it just went on. It was so funny. It just went. But yes, all the animals, all the pairs of animals would have needed clean straw and their beds cleaned out, and then the chickens needed to have their eggs gathered, and the doves were mating, and just went on and on and on. So it was funny. So almost 12 months, 365 days later, they stepped out of the ark. Mm-hmm.
I was just putting myself in
The faith,
on the boat and thinking, my goodness, the whole year.
Yeah.
I think my concern would be not having a shower.
Well, they would have just opened the window and scooped up a bucket of water and could have taken a shower that way. But just having fresh water to feed all the animals. Now, probably the rainwater was fresh. It probably wasn't salty ocean water, but just the mammoth job that day after day after day for 360. Just the overwhelmingness. And you're right, the amount of faith that hey, God's going to bring it into this someday, somehow. So, 365 days later. Capital B, understanding Noah's covenant. Understanding Noah's covenant. Number one, who made the covenant and why? The first mention of the word covenant occurs in Genesis 6:18, when Jehovah commands Noah to build an ark. Again, a loving Jehovah establishes a covenant with a righteous man to limit the spread of wickedness. And this covenant with Noah was one, irrevocable. In other words, God instituted the covenant and it could not be changed. It was universal. It applied to every living creature ever on earth. It was unconditional. No ongoing conditions were set for Noah. The only thing he had to do was to build the ark and gather all the animals and the food and go into the ark. But he didn't have to keep on being a righteous person. He didn't have to go on making sure he never sinned. Fourth, it was permanent and everlasting. No one could undo the consequences of the flood. Permanent and everlasting. So the flood happened, and the consequences we see around us today. We have mountains and valleys and rivers, and it rains.
I find it amazing how God destroyed the flood because of the evil of mankind.
Yes.
And yet it's happened all over again.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, was it really worth doing it the first time? Because it's just as evil now.
Perhaps it's just as evil now. That's one thing how God does that, limits mankind. Because that's one of the reasons why Israel was put into Canaan, went in to conquer Canaan, because of the evilness of the Canaanites. So whether the wickedness is as great now as what it was then, it certainly is going to get as great before Jesus comes back in Revelations. But yes, but then again, that's part of a long-suffering, patient God to keep giving people time after time after time after time to change their ways. That he has such patience.
I would not forget it. I would have given up on it.
Yeah, but then when you put it back in the time frame of almost 7,000 years, We're not talking about millions of years where God has gone round and round and round and round and round and round. And he had to, it's almost like God had to put up with a certain amount of wickedness in order to get the next covenant in. And he had to get the next covenant in so he could begin to build so that he could get the Messiah to come. So that the Messiah coming could build the stableness of the country, of the civilization, so that he could begin to bring us to where we are today. But the evilness and the wickedness is just going down, yeah. So the darkness is getting darker and the light's getting lighter. But patience and long-suffering, yes.
You're saying there weren't any mountains in the valleys before?
That's,
It was all flat.
I think so. There may have been very gentle hills, but there's certainly, the first time it talks about mountains is when the ark landed on Mount Ararat. So the ark landed on a mountain. So according to the discoveries, the creation discoveries that they made, there was not mountains like we know it today. That only formed when the huge floods and the, like Jan said, the gushing of the water coming up would have carved out huge valleys and lifted up the land, and then the land plates began to shift and to move from that point onwards as well. So the continents begin to shift apart from each other like they are today. It's amazing. Just to digress for a minute, I think there's some movements, some 7 different movements that the earth is making right now. Do you feel like you're moving? At times you do. Okay, there's the spinning this way, so the night and the day. Now if I can see if I can remember this from my science class. So spinning around this way. It's tilting on its axis, so from the summer to winter tilt. It's traveling around the sun. Then evidently the sun and all the planets are traveling around in whatever motion. Then that solar system is moving, and then the whole known solar system is also moving apart. So there's some 7 movements that the earth is making all the time. Pretty amazing that we've got a creator God that big that can design all of that and hold that all together. It's amazing. 2, the words of the covenant. The words of the covenant. Before the flood occurred, the covenant was based on the obedience of Noah and his family. He was to build and live in the ark and was to collect a specific number of creatures from the earth. After the flood, in Genesis 8:20-22, Jehovah Elohim promised, number 1, that he was never again to curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of man's heart was evil from childhood onwards. So God said he would never again curse the ground because of mankind's evil. That he would never again to destroy all living creatures off the earth as he did in the flood. And even in Revelations it talks about 1/3 of the population having this, and 1/3 of the rivers, and 1/3 of this, and 1/3 of that, and 1/3 of that. So even in Revelation in the end times, until there's a new heavens and a new earth, evidently all the animal population will never be completely destroyed. Then, new cycles and seasons were given for seed time and harvest. Climates were set with hot and cold times, summer and winter, day and night. So climates began from the time of the flood onwards. Cycles of seed time and harvest, hot and cold times happened. Summer and winter. So those all began from the time of Noah's flood. So evidently, up until then, the climate was what? Pretty much the same, uniform. So probably fairly warm, but not hot. And harvest could have happened at any time. Seed time and planting would have been there would have been no distinction between the two. So you go out and plant your corn any time of year and harvest. And so only after the Noah's flood did all of that begin to change. 3, the terms of the agreement. Noah's covenant added to Adam's covenant. So with Adam and Eve, their descendants were given every vegetable and herb as their diet. So they had a huge selection of every vegetable and herb in the Garden of Eden. Now under Noah's time, Noah's covenant, God said all things that live and move to be food. Meat was given to eat, but not their lifeblood. So under Noah's covenant, meat was given to mankind to be able to eat. Then men... Yep.
Why
I would suspect that because of the changes in the climate, that the food value of vegetables and herbs weren't going to be enough to keep human beings alive. So that the protein now was given for the meat. Which means then Noah and his family, their whole metabolism then began to change as well because of the climate changes. That's why I would suspect. So God meant for mankind to eat meat, but not their lifeblood. And you see that theme throughout the sacrifices as well, in Abraham and in Moses' time. Probably to establish the fact that Jesus' blood was very pure and not to be defamed. That blood was a very special substance, because life is in the blood. Then B, mankind would exert dominion over the animals as the garden was forbidden to Adam and the fear and dread of mankind. And even animals that have never been around man very much have a fear, a dread. That's why you can't walk up to birds and creatures in the wild, because they have a fear, a dread of human beings that go all the way back from Noah's time. See, Abel's blood cried out for God's justice, and God set the punishment for Cain. And when Cain killed Abel, God set the punishment for Cain. He banished him, he gave him a mark, he set him away from the rest of the human race. However, under Noah's covenant, murder is forbidden, for God made man, and then God put capital punishment in the hands of human beings. So that has interesting implications when you think about the argument for capital punishment today. So Noah and his descendants were given the right of capital punishment. So they were given the right of how to punish, how much punishment was given to human beings rather than God doing it. D, climate and land mass was stable. Moisture came from the mists that watered the land under under Adam and Eve, sorry. But with Noah, continents began to shift, mountains appeared, rain came, weather and climate began to change. So it could be it was at that point that the earth began to shift in the axis, so that summer and winter happened. And maybe before then the earth just spun round and round and round. Now under Noah's covenant, the responsibility for setting up human government and for capital punishment was given to mankind. God has never revoked the right to execute murders. That's an interesting comment. Any comment on that? I don't want to turn this into a big bun fight over capital punishment, but you can see that that's when it started, way back there with Noah.
Execute murderers.
Murderers. Add another ER. My copy checker didn't catch it. Sorry?
I mean, you've got to be sure with the DNA testing now there's realising they have executed people who were guilty.
Yeah, and they've always done that. They've always executed people, particularly in countries where there's not a due process of law, where they don't have lawyers, where they don't have criminal courts. So, yes.
I mean, it's an interesting debate because it puzzles me, especially in Acts. The only time I can see it is when the Ananias and Sapphira were struck dead.
When God did that with Ananias and Sapphira.
I haven't seen it in Victoria, shall we say, but I'm sure it still happens around the world.
Yes. God still reserves the right for his justice, and his law of sowing and reaping have always been into effect. So if a person sows acts of violence and crime, that they will reap that as well. So God has his system of balances and checks and balances, but it's like he has given the right of execution and government into human hands. Probably where it started to get complicated is when we've come into the new covenant with Jesus, and a lot of people say, well, criminals ought to be forgiven. And yes, that's true. But what's the difference between most criminals and the believer?
They're not saved.
They're not saved, therefore their heart has not been changed.
Well, that would have been the argument that I would have had, because I would think that as long as someone is alive, no matter what they've done, there's always a possibility that God can reach them. And often when people are in prison, they're so aware that they're sinners that you don't have to tell them that.
Mhm.
And that's often a place where they could very possibly find.
That's true. And lots of people have found God in jails and sentenced to pretty severe execution. Yes. Sorry?
There was a girl not long ago in America
Mm-hmm.
and was executed.
Mm-hmm. And what was the controversy surrounding the case?
Oh, just the execution of them.
Mm.
She really brutally murdered.
Yeah.
She brutally murdered
She was
someone.
only young. She was only in her 20s,
Governor
I think.
Bush could have revoked the
Yes.
order
Yes.
just at that time in the elections, and he didn't. And he is supposedly a Christian, so he just said no.
Yes.
She has to face the punishment.
She has to face the punishment. But she was forgiven. Shouldn't she have been released from the crime?
There's another story.
Hang on, before you go into another story, that's where the complication happens, because a lot of times, particularly in the Western courts, a lot of our legal system is based on Christian values. And part of the Christian value is like what you were saying, to give them a chance to come to God. So the Western court system can be very lenient in that side. And if someone comes and does commit a crime, it's like where is the penalty for their crime, particularly if they've found the Lord and they've been forgiven. Should the state then say, okay, you've had a heart change, you're not that same person anymore, so you're excused from the crime? And that was the big debate that was going on.
I think, I don't know if this is the answer, but there's certainly some evidence to suggest that when Jesus was around, when Matthew repented of his ways,
Yes,
he returned
he
to
was
the way.
forgiven. Jesus forgave them, yes.
But he did actually act out and returned all the money that he'd stolen. Or I think it was someone else, it was Zacchaeus or someone else. So there is some suggestion that there is a price to pay even beyond being converted.
So there's I'm repeating some of this for the tape, so that there is a price to pay even though you have gone through a conversion experience, yes.
God doesn't necessarily take away that.
God still requires the consequences of the action. But you can see, the more you get into it, the more complicated it becomes. Because what if it is someone who says they've become a Christian and had a heart change, but really hasn't? Should they be let out of jail for having killed somebody? So,
A good lawyer.
it depends on if they've got a good lawyer. Yeah, good point. So it starts getting complicated and starts getting tricky, especially when we, as Christians, try to apply Christian principles to non-believers, to people who aren't Christians. And we try to provide the leniency for them because they say they've had a heart change, or we think maybe they will have a heart change. So the whole thing just gets blurred and complicated. It doesn't have an easy answer. And particularly when you apply it back to, that's the whole focus of mankind anyhow, is to find right and wrong. So it's very easy for us to get our mind, now that's right and that's wrong, and yes, that's right, and this is what we do and this is what we don't do. So it gets a fair bit complicated, and it's issues to think through. You started to say, Peggy?
I just wanted to say too that I remember in the film Dead Man Walking, where you get the two sides of the story, and even, well, we don't really know whether the man was saved or not, but the parents of the victim needed justice, and I think it would be terrible whether someone was saved or not, for the victim's relations to not see some form of justice. And God is a God of justice as well, isn't he?
Yes. So for the victims to see some form of justice. And that's basically where, when Cain killed Abel, Abel's blood cried from the ground saying, come on, where's my justice? So yes, I think God is a God of justice, and I know at the great white throne, the end of time, that's where a lot of people will get their justice, when God metes out the punishment for the acts we've done here on earth for unbelievers.
That's where God gave that authority for them to execute justice. There was still that element where divine intervention could come with those cities of refuge, wasn't it?
Yes,
They
yes.
assumed if they reached that was they were innocent. So I mean that could have been God's protection.
Yes.
Or if they were guilty, they would be caught before.
So under the covenant with Moses, he established resident covenant cities where a murderer or someone who committed a crime, especially if it was accidental, could go and seek refuge. Yes.
So they assumed
That assumed that. Yeah, they had a chance, then they would have had a chance to state the case, where if they were out, if they still stayed in their town, probably the brothers would have come and executed justice. Because back then it was the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Yes. So you can see where a lot of these issues have come from, all the way back from Noah's time, when God gave the right of human punishment, of human government into the hands of people.
So will we cover this thing? There are covenants that come through the Old Testament, and there's the covenant in the New Testament.
That's right.
So does it not talk about one annulling the other?
Some things are annulled and some things are not. So back on what we said up here on some things are irrevocable and some things are revocable. So if you go back to the first session that we did, sort of answers that. Go back to page 4, session 1. So some covenants are irrevocable, so God fulfills the conditions regardless of what man has done. Some conditions are revocable. In other words, God fulfills the promises if mankind does something.
So could we go through each of the covenants and determine what was revocable and what was irrevocable?
That's right. You'd be a good student of Kevin Conner if you did that, because that's exactly what he taught. Yes, that's right. And some covenants are everlasting, eternal. Some covenants are only temporal. So some parts of Noah's covenant was temporal. Some parts of Noah's covenant was everlasting. Some parts of Abraham, Moses', David's covenant are everlasting, and some things are temporal and to be passed away. So when we get into Moses' covenant, that's what we'll talk about, is what things were temporal because Jesus fulfilled them, such as the sacrificial system. Those were temporal part of the covenant because Jesus became the sacrifice. He became the perfect lamb. So yes, some things are temporal, some things are done away with, some are everlasting. Any other comments?
Fine, I can't put a but in forgiveness.
Sorry?
I can't take Jesus' forgiveness and put a but with it.
So it's not conditional. That's true. Yes, Jesus doesn't require you to go out and, I don't know if this is what you mean, but doesn't require you to go out and whip yourself to make yourself be sorry. That if you are repentant, He forgives you. So there's not a but, because Jesus fulfilled all of that.
There's no hidden price to pay further down the track.
There's no hidden price to pay further down the track. That's a good way to put it. Okay, so climate and landmass began to change, continents began to shift. So right to execute murderers. Number 4, other parts to the covenant with Noah. They had a sacrifice to ratify the agreement. Noah killed some of the clean animals as a thanksgiving for their deliverance, Genesis 8:20. However, this sacrifice seems unrelated to keeping the covenant with God. In other words, Noah didn't have to do that in order to make and keep the covenant with God. He did it out of thanksgiving. The seal of the covenant was a sign of the rainbow, and that's an everlasting sign. It was given as God's eternal promise to never wipe mankind out by water again. Man has no obligations to fulfill anything in order to keep the rainbow as a sign. In fact, there's another place where we shall all see the rainbow. Where's that? Besides out in nature. Around the throne of God, that's right. There's the rainbow around the throne of God that shows His eternal promise to us. The mediator of the covenant, Jehovah, was the divine instigator and mediator. No oath was taken by Jehovah other than His word as God. Noah took on a priest-mediator role, both for that particular incident and then for his whole family later on. The place of the covenant, the holy place, from the ark to the new cleansed sanctuary of Mount Ararat. Noah and his family had the opportunity to make a fresh start in keeping God's laws. And wouldn't it be great if part of the history was, and Noah became righteous, and he was righteous all the rest of his life, and human beings lived in the righteousness of God forever and ever. Wouldn't that be great? However, number 5, the story continued. It could not have happened, that's right, because of why? Has sin had entered and corrupted the human heart. That's right, because the heart wasn't changed. And all the covenants, particularly the covenant with Moses and with the law came along, the law did not touch the heart. And so people could keep the law to a certain level, but the heart still was not changed. It's only under the new covenant with Jesus that the heart is changed. So you're right, they couldn't have. That's true. The story, human story, continued. As we know from Genesis 9:26 to 27, grape juice now became fermented, and Noah's 3 sons found him drunk. Ham humiliated Noah by seeing him naked. Therefore, Ham brought a curse on himself and his descendants. Now, it's interesting, there's several different translations of this when I was reading through. It could be either just the fact that Ham began to brag about seeing the old man and he was, soused and he was naked, and wasn't this a funny story? That was one description one writer thought that brought the Noah's reaction when he heard the story Ham was telling around, and so he cursed Ham. Another person thought that there must have been some sort of undercover sexual perversion going on in the whole thing that brought the curse, because the curse is pretty serious. I mean, you see someone, probably seeing someone naked back then may not have been such a big deal. I mean, they lived a whole year in the ark. I'm sure they would have seen Dad doing all kinds of things. But this was pretty serious. It brought some sort of a curse. So it was either out of humiliation because there was some sort of perversion going on, or just the fact of Ham, making such a big spectacle about it and telling everybody about it. And so he brought a curse on himself and his descendants. So Noah actually pronounced a curse on his son because of what had happened there.
What I understand is why is it that Ham's son had to suffer because of his father? Why was it all on him?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I know that sometimes the father of the line has enough authority in his words. It's like then the enemy picks it up and makes that come true. So Ham, his descendants were Cush and Nimrod, starting the Canaanite peoples. So remember, further down the story, the land of Canaan was where God sent the Israelites. So Cush, Nimrod, starting the Canaanite people, also possibly the peoples of Greece, Egypt, Chaldea, China, where the Tower of Babel happened. Remember, all God told them that they were to spread out. I might be a little bit ahead of myself here, but God told them to spread out. Yes, I am a little bit ahead of myself. Told them to spread out throughout the whole earth. But Nimrod gathered the people together, a direct rebellion against God's commandment. And they started their own way to get to heaven, and they built this huge, humongous tower. You just imagine how, what a huge project that would have been to build this big tower. So that's the Tower of Babel.
China?
Possibly China, people from China come underneath under Ham's descendants. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah. Shem becomes the father of the Arabs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Israel, and the line that produced Abraham and later the Messiah. Then Jephthah spread north through Persia, Europe, Russia, and those nations of the earth. So they began the Caucasian peoples of the earth. So right there, the spread of the 3 sons into the different places in the earth, and after the next, what would it be, 4,000 years of living in the Sahara Desert, what would have happened to the skin of human beings? It would have gotten darker and darker and darker and darker and darker. So that supposedly that's why the dark-skinned people of the world have resulted. And then as fair-skinned Caucasians, from living in climates that produce lighter-skinned Caucasians. So those were the 3 sons. Sorry?
God created them.
Well, it's possible, but it doesn't say anything about it. It doesn't say that Shem was darker in skin and therefore produced all these generations of darker-skinned Arab people. So, as you can imagine, there's a lot of questions and controversy about this. Now, the actual curse that was pronounced on Ham was that he would be a servant of his brothers and the people following him. Now, some white supremacists have taken that, saying that Ham was the father of all the black tribes. Therefore, the black man needs to be the servant to the white tribes, which is a lot of baloney. It actually worked out that Ham's descendants were the people of, Shem. Where are we? Ham was the one that humiliated Noah. That his descendants actually, when Israel went into the land, some of the descendants were there and were actually the servants of the Israelites. But I don't think you can apply it to the white supremacist stand that all black people therefore are servants of white people. But that's where they get that verse, and that's where they get some of their racist reasons for treating the blacks as they do. Conclusion. Noah's covenant and the great flood brought a dramatic close to a chapter in mankind's history when great evil and wickedness flourished. Never again would the world know such horrific judgment until the end days, when a new heavens and a new earth will allow a new beginning. So the times in Revelation of the tribulation and all the seals and all the judgments, the earth will go through terrible times as well, but never to the point of being flooded and all of mankind being completely wiped off the face of the earth, because God said that would never happen again. Unfortunately, the Noahic covenant didn't change the condition of the human heart. So the destructive evil patterns began again, breaking the need for the next redemptive covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Any comments? So that was Noah.
Sorry, Susie.
Uh-huh.
List of like Greece, Egypt, and China.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that come from?
Actually, there's different studies. While you brought that up, here's one of the sources I found that information on. Actually, back when I was in Bible college, I found a big long scroll that laid out human history all the way from Cain and Abel, all the way from Adam and Eve through Genesis all the way to Revelation. And a friend of mine loaned me this one, which is not quite the same sort of thing, but it is. But it starts out with Adam and Eve. Starts out, I'll put it out on the table and you can have a look at it. So it starts out with the timeline with Adam and Eve and Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let's say it's out of order here. And it goes on to the Medo-Persian Empire, the silent years before Jesus came. And it goes on to the timeline with the New Testament timeline, present age, and then into some of the things with the book of Revelation. So it lays out the whole of human history with the timeline up at the top and all the different dates. So I'll put it on a table and let you have a look at it over a cuppa. Well, this is one they got through the homeschooling network. I can find out if it's still available if you'd like. They gave it to me. They've had it now about 10 years, so I'm not sure. I really wish I could find the original one that I had from my Bible school days, because that was really something special. It was really good. So would you like me to find out if it's still available? Okay, let me get it in order for you. How about let's stop and have a cuppa. The covenant between God and Abraham. Introduction. The covenantal arrangement with Abraham starts a new chapter in God's dealings with mankind. So again, we see, just like somebody pointed out, God brings a new beginning, a new chapter, a new start, and mankind goes downhill. And God begins a new chapter, a new start, and mankind goes downhill. So with Abraham, here's a new chapter, a new beginnings. The covenant arrangement with Abram starts with a new chapter in God's dealings with mankind. Genesis chapters 12 to 25 continue the story as Jehovah begins to build a people for himself through one man, Abram. This covenant was given after the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the descendants of Noah. B. Abram becomes the father of all who believe. The father of all who believe. Number 1, review of man's history to date. God gave mankind a new beginning with a cleansed earth. However, since mankind's heart was not changed, their corrupt nature soon became evident again. So as we've said, every covenant hasn't touched the true human condition, the true human heart, until the new covenant came along. Ham dishonored his father, brought a curse on himself and his succeeding generations. Unfortunately, many ignorant people have taken advantage of this curse over Ham as an excuse for white supremacy, racism, and bigotry. Nimrod, interesting character in the Bible. People have done a study on Nimrod. He evidently was a hunter, a very virile man of all man sort of person. A man for every man. Nimrod led a rebellion against God's command to spread out and replenish the earth by drawing all the people together at Babel. God stepped in and again stopped their plans to reach God's throne by building the great Tower of Babel. By confusing their language, he scattered the peoples across the earth, thus dividing them into nations. So at that point, the languages began to change. People spread across the world based on the Ham, Shem, Jethan, different tribes, different groups.
Did they all speak English?
Sorry?
The one language?
Of course. Adam and Eve spoke English too. That's very true. We won't have a debate on that, huh?
How do you read the Tower of Babel?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you read it as a physical...
I think it was an actual physical event. Yes?
I'm just trying to understand the concept of reaching God's throne.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of view of today's technology enabling us to fly in space.
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of like missed the throne on the way. Or something.
Missed the throne on the way. Well, first of all, God's throne is in the spiritual dimension. Now, whether there's an actual physical dimension that someday we will see, could be, or it could be that the spiritual dimension that where God's throne is, that when we are perfected and we have spiritual eyes, we can see where it is. That could be. But evidently they believed that if they built a tower high enough, they could reach where God was.
So it was an attitude of the heart of,
Yes.
of pride and...
Yep, and of trying to reach God their own way. Mm-hmm. So again, that theme comes down of human beings not doing it God's way, trying to set up their own way to reach God.
Frank Sinatra wasn't the first.
Sorry?
Frank Sinatra wasn't the first.
That's true. That's true. So he led a rebellion against God, evidently, in the whole issue. 2, the scene for this covenant with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. Noah, again, Jehovah searched the earth for one faithful man to teach and establish his covenant. He called to Abram to leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. So at age 75, again, notice the age differences are starting to come in a whole lot more since the flood. At 75, Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions and went on a faith journey. They left the land of Haran and traveled into Canaan. It was here that Abram was given the promise of the land, and he was given the promise of many descendants. C, understanding the Abrahamic covenant. 1, who made the covenant and why? Jehovah's plan was to establish a people of his own, people who would obey him, form a covenantal relationship with him. Through this covenant, God would bring to pass the other plans for future generations. So again, we see God building another covenant established on the ones that he'd already had with Adam and Eve, with Noah. He was now building on a covenant with Abraham. 2, terms of the covenant. Adam's covenant had 2 major sections. 1 was for faith. Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. And the second thing, obedience. Abraham showed his faith by unquestioning obedience. Now, where have you run into faith and obedience before? How important is faith and obedience to our covenant? Very important, very important. So here, because of what Abraham did, it was like that was establishing the right for God to continue emphasizing how important faith was. And yes, Noah needed a certain amount of faith, but probably when he heard God's voice from heaven, he must have had a fairly definite witness. And then to all of the, we were just saying over the break, the amount of lumber, of timber it would have needed in order to make a ship half the size of an ocean liner. I would have just all the people would have probably ridiculed Noah, what do you mean rain? What's rain? We've never had any rain. And just on and on and on and on and on. So faith and obedience. And again, this is part of the foundation for the new covenant that Jesus has with God. The blessings of the covenant, these are the blessings that came with Abraham's obedience. So God promised certain blessings to Abraham. First, the promise of personal blessings to Abraham. Then a promise of blessings given to those who bless Abraham. And you can see down through some of the history in the Old Testament, that's exactly what happened. The people who blessed the Israelites, the children of Israel, were blessed. Abraham was to be a blessing to others, a blessing to the whole earth, all families and nations through his descendants. And of course, through his descendants would come the Messiah. So that would be the greatest blessings of all. Abraham's offspring would reign as kings, and we see that in David and in Solomon and the line that followed after David. Abraham's name was to be made great. In fact, the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews, the three major religions of the world, all honor Abraham. So his name is great. Jehovah would greatly multiply his seed, and we see that happening as well. Promises for Abraham to possess the land of Canaan. It was to be an everlasting possession. Then Abraham would be given victory over his enemies. The promise that Jehovah would be a God to him and to his seed after him. And there are all the different verses there that show you where those promises were fulfilled, or where the promises were given. Then the consequences or curse. That Nahum the prophet that was hired to curse the children of Israel by the king? Wasn't Nahum, was it Nahum? Balaam, that's right, Balaam. And he kept going back to the king saying, well, I can't curse those that God has blessed. I can't pronounce a cursing. So that's in Genesis 12:3, carried out Genesis 27:26-29, and in Numbers. Other parts of the covenant that Abraham said, other parts of the Abrahamic covenant, the sacrifice to ratify the agreement. Now with Abraham's covenant, it was a progressive unfolding sacrificial process, and it included several steps. First of all, with Melchizedek, remember the story of Abraham coming back from one of his victories, and he met someone called Melchizedek that had no beginning, that had no end. Genesis 14:18. Jehovah introduced the symbolism of the bread and wine. And it was at that point when Abraham gave 10% of all of his treasures to Melchizedek, and Melchizedek shared a bread and wine, symbolizing bread and wine of the new covenant. Then an animal sacrifice was also given for the blood covenant, and that's in Genesis 15:5-17. And then the third part was Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Now go back to B, because it's very easy just to read that, an animal sacrifice for the blood covenant. But if you go back and read it in Genesis, it's a story of Abraham taking the animals that were sacrificed as for this covenant and splitting them down the middle and laying them out as parts on the desert floor. Then what happened? Sorry? Yes, he was to walk through them, and then the presence of God went through those sacrifices as well. And we sort of read it now, and we have a very sanitized view of what that would have been like. First, Abraham had to catch and kill the animals, which would have been a very bloody business. And then to lay out the animal carcasses, and just the awesomeness of God's presence, of the witness of God walking through those sacrifices with him. If you get a chance, go back and read that section in Genesis, because we have a very sanitized view when we say, yes, he had an animal sacrifice. But it was very graphic, very descriptive there in Genesis of what Abraham went through. And that was the seal of the covenant when God told him how to do the animal sacrifices. 2, the seal of the covenant. Circumcision was the token and the seal, and it was given as a sign of the covenant. So Abraham was given the token of circumcision, and he started circumcision for the whole of the Jewish race after that. So the seal involved, 1, the cutting of the flesh of the baby, of the male baby, a shedding of blood. So actually cutting away of the foreskin off the penis. Then certain rites and symbolisms were carried out as a sign of obedience to Jehovah. So there were prayers that were said over the baby as the circumcision was happening. Then at that point, that 7 days later, the baby was given a name. And all of this was laying the grounds for spiritual circumcision of the new covenant. So theirs was an actual physical circumcision that applied to the new covenant, where a spiritual circumcision of the heart would be happening. The seal of circumcision was so important that Jehovah faced Moses with a decision: circumcise his son or die and be excluded from God's plans. So before Abraham could go into the land of Canaan, there was a big kerfuffle with Abraham and his wife. And the bottom of it was that God said he wanted him to circumcise his son. And to start with, Sarah said, "You're not doing that to any son of mine." And she hadn't grown up with circumcision to that point, and it was pretty horrific. But as the story unfolds, it's like God began to show both of them that unless they had the son Isaac circumcised, he could not go into the land. So evidently, the story goes that Sarah actually went and got the flint and actually did the circumcision herself and threw it at her husband's feet and said, "There, now we can do what God's telling us to do." So that's a bit of a loose translation, but evidently that's how the story went. So it was so important to God that Abraham circumcised Isaac that it was a choice between die and not go into the land or get your son circumcised. And so Isaac was circumcised.
Wasn't it ever done before that?
Sorry?
Wasn't it ever done before that? I thought I'd read that it was
Yes.
unknown.
Evidently in some of the pagan people, they did that it was more as a cruelty ritual for idolatry to their gods. So yes, it was common practice in some of the places around the world at that time, some of the pagan tribes. No Israelite or foreigner could partake of the Passover feast unless they had the seal of circumcision. So every male had to be circumcised in the Jewish culture, and is still to this day. It's very important to be circumcised. I'm glad we've got the new covenant. However, I'm not a male, so. 2, the mediator of this covenant. The beginnings of the priesthood were established with the encounter with Melchizedek in Genesis 14. He was also a king of righteousness and a king of peace, representing both the office of the coming Messiah and the believer's position in Jesus Christ. It's interesting to go back and do a study on Melchizedek, because he had no beginning and no end, no mother and no father. There's no recorded evidence of Melchizedek anywhere else in the Old Testament or in history, except here.
Do you have any theories about that?
Sorry?
Do you have any theories?
Have any theories? Well, I think it was God establishing the precedent that Melchizedek represented. So whether it was an angel or an actual physical human being, I don't know. But he was the priest that set up, that from the pattern there where he met Abraham, that set up a lot of the patterns for the priesthood later on. One of those unanswerable questions you'll have to ask Father God at the end of time. Where did Melchizedek come from? And where is he now? B, this continued the priesthood role of Adam, Noah, and Job into Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and on to the Levitical priesthood under Moses. Abraham stepped into this role when he built an altar and offered sacrifices to Jehovah for his family and for Lot. And of course the priesthood of all believers then comes into that as well in the new covenant. 4, the place of the covenant, the holy place, the sanctuary. All 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, built altars that were later replaced by the tabernacle that Moses was instructed to build. Remember, God told God told Moses to build this big tent, the tent of meeting, which later became the tabernacle that they built. Any other questions?
With the circumcision,
Mm-hmm.
wasn't there Moses and his wife? I remember it said that his wife told him he was supposed to circumcise his own son too. And she said, and she made a comment about that he's a blood of something.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Abraham. Go back and have a look, but I think you're talking about Abraham and Sarah.
I'm sure there was also Moses.
There as well?
Sephora, whatever her name was.
Okay.
Because I mentioned about her.
Okay, yep, sorry, you're right. The seal of circumcision was so important that Jehovah faced Moses with the decision to circumcise his son, yes. So God wouldn't even let Moses begin bringing the children of Israel into the promised land until his son was circumcised. Yes, so I beg your pardon, it wasn't Isaac after all.
No, I didn't do it right.
Yeah, good, Maria, that's right. So I got Moses right.
Yes.
Yeah. E, the fulfillment of the covenant. The fulfillment of this covenant. First of all, the fulfillment is in Christ. Jesus fulfilled all the requirements for this covenant with his own circumcision rite, ritual, and naming process. So Jesus went through circumcision, he went through naming on the seventh day. So he went through all the ceremonial circumcision rites to become the Jew that he was. The waters of Jesus' baptism pointed to his death, resurrection, and exaltation, and thus entering the promised land. So again, Jesus fulfilled that. Jesus' experience on Calvary with the cutting of his flesh and the shedding of his blood. So again, he fulfilled that type, the fulfillment for Abraham's covenant. And fulfillment by Christians, water baptism, their identification with Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and his position of honor with the Father, shows that we too, like Abraham, have entered into the promised land. Through the circumcision of the heart, we have a cutting off of the fleshly life, experiencing new life, and the walking in the Spirit in the name of the Lord Jesus. So again, some of the types and shadows that come through Abraham's covenant are fulfilled through Jesus and brought all the way into the new covenant. So again, it's like God's laying line upon line, precept upon precept to establish his covenant. With one person, then he builds in the next covenant, and then the next covenant, and then the next covenant. Any other comments?
Just going back to the blessings, can I go?
Back to the blessings.
Well, I mean, this one of the stumbling blocks now, isn't it, about the land? Because it was a permanent, it was to be an everlasting possession.
An everlasting possession given to the descendants of Abraham. Now, the only problem is Abraham had two sons. He had one to Hagar, the slave woman, Ishmael. And it's interesting that if you go back and look through the Old Testament, Ishmael had 12 sons. And then along comes Isaac. Yeah, Isaac. And Jacob had 12 sons. No, I'm still off the beam here. Where's our thingy here? So it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel and has the 12 tribes. So Jacob was let me just get this right here. Isaac was the promised son to Abraham and Sarah. That's right. But before Isaac came along, Abraham went into Hagar, the handmaiden, and Ishmael was conceived. All right, so you've got Ishmael and Isaac have set up the two rival kingdoms. And there was a lot of bitterness and anger between Hagar and Sarai. And Hagar was actually told to leave, asked, probably not too politely, she was kicked out of the tribe and went out underneath the shade bush with Ishmael, and they both almost died, but God rescued them and said that he would make a great nation out of Ishmael as well. Ishmael had the 12 sons, who are now the fathers of the Arab nations. So,
God did that to fulfill his promise to Abraham.
Well, I think it's an example of all of us can get ahead of God and take things into our own hands. Because if Ishmael hadn't been born, there wouldn't be near the problems that the Israelites have today because of all the Arab nations. I think because Abraham did take it into his own hands, Ishmael was conceived and born, and then God honored Ishmael because he was honoring his covenant with Abraham. And Ishmael was of the seed of Abraham, so he did honor Ishmael and gave him part of the lands.
Because he was Abraham's seed.
Sorry?
Only because he was Abraham's seed.
Because he was Abraham's seed.
As opposed to being.
Yes. In fact, Paul writes about the using that as a type and example, that one whole people are born that are physically the inheritance, the descendants of the Jews. But they aren't the spiritual inheritance, so they aren't the rightful possessors of the new covenant. That comes through Isaac. So we've got the spiritual Israelism, the spiritual Israel, and the actual natural Israelism. So yes.
So the Jews won't acknowledge that line at all?
They acknowledge it, yes, but they believe that through Isaac the promises were given for the Canaan land, where the Arabs believe that through Ishmael the promise was given for the land. And of course most of the Ishmaelites are Muslims today. So all the contest and the rivalry that's gone down through the generations between Ishmael and Isaac. And then you get into Jacob and Esau. They were twins, and there's conflict between them as well down through the history of the generations.
Makes you realise that the sin of one generation can
Greatly, sin of one generation greatly affects the next generations down. Yes. God takes it into account, and like we said, I think he honors Ishmael because he is Abraham's seed. But the true spiritual descendants came through Isaac. That was where the promise was, through Sarai. Yes. So all those blessings were promised on the descendants of Abraham. And because Ishmael was part of his descendants, Ishmael does get some of those blessings. How are we doing so far? Okay, conclusion. The covenant between Abraham is fulfilled by the new covenant relationship between Jesus and the Father, and between Jesus and us when he circumcises our heart. It's not through the letter of the law and obedience to rules and rituals, but by the Spirit's work in our life. And again, we'll see that very strongly in the covenant with Moses, where Moses was given the law, and the 10 Commandments, and all the ceremonial and sacrificial law. So even through all of that, it didn't cause people to be right with God. Because it still didn't change their heart. So it's not through the letter of the law or obedience to rules and rituals, but by the Spirit's work in our life. Abraham's faith previewed that Jehovah would be a father to all who believed, whether Jew or Gentile. This truth is confirmed in the new creation that is brought into being by the circumcision of the heart. Thus Abraham's covenant was both spiritual and physical, setting the path for the coming of the next covenant, that of Moses. In our next session, Jehovah continues to lay the foundation for his Messiah by the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Symbolic promises, national, geographic, natural, and spiritual promises. And those promises have come down to us today. So our next covenant we're going to talk about is Abraham. And if you want to, you can read that next part in Genesis and Exodus, because we'll talk about the covenant with Moses and the covenant with Joshua as he leads the people into their lands. Some food for thought. Now, some of this we've already talked about, so it's sort of ho-hum. Comparing the earth's environment for Adam's descendants with that of Noah's. And we talked about how the terrain, mountains, valleys, rivers changed, climates changed, seasons, rainfall, fermentation, and a lot of the changes that happened on earth after Noah's flood, after the great flood. Then, with each covenant, we get more information about God. So complete the following chart on the information God gave to mankind through his covenant with Abraham. So with Abraham's covenant, what do we learn about God's nature? Somebody already mentioned how long-suffering and patient God is. It just seems to go round and round. Now, you're not going to be able to fill all of that in that little tiny space, so you might want to do it on another piece of paper. Sorry? Very faithful. That's right. He was faithful to honor the covenant. Even though mankind wasn't faithful, he still honored the covenant again and again and again. Then you can pick out God's purposes and God's theme. And if this was a real Bible college for you, I'd have you write me a 500-word essay just on that. So on the purposes, we saw God wanted a people of his own, the themes that have come through for the Messiah, for setting the sacrifice system, a lot of those basic blocks of what we've talked about already. Then God's themes, same thing. Timeline. This is interesting too. Look over on Appendix A, timeline for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the year 2300 BC, the flood happened. Shem, then all the generations that came down to Terah, who was 70 when Abram was born, and Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob was born, which then went into the 12 tribes because they had 12 sons and one daughter. How would you like to be the only girl growing up with 12 brothers? All depends on whether you like brothers or not. Yes. Yes. And then I've listed the 4 different wives that Abraham had, wives, concubines, whatever you want to call them. First one was Leah. She gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and her daughter was Dinah. Sons of Rachel was Joseph and Benjamin. Then Rachel's handmaid Bilhah had Dan and Naphtali, and then Leah's maid was Zephon, Gad, and Asher. So from there the 12 tribes of Israel began. So each of those 12 young men went off and married a female, and that was the 12 tribes. Very unhappy story about poor Dinah. If you get a chance to go back and read it. Depends on whose translation. I remember reading a book called The Red Tent. It's fascinating because it gave more the whole story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from a female's perspective. And the reason it was called The Red Tent is because once a month all the women had to do what?
Separate themselves.
That's right, separate themselves, and they went and lived in the red tent for about 4 or 5 days for their monthly cycle. And that was the time when all kinds of stories got passed down from mother to daughter and all kinds of tradition. And so her being the only daughter, having lots of sister-in-laws, lots of women in the tribe, she was a very, very, very special young woman growing up because she was the only daughter of Jacob. So it was her story. Evidently the author was saying that she met and fell in love with one of the princes of the local tribes, and her brothers, when they found that out, put up a big stink about it and claiming that she was raped. And so they gave her to be married to this prince. But shortly after their marriage, what did dear brothers do? They go in and slaughtered the whole tribe. And so according to this story, Dinah's heart was broken because she really loved the man. So, and she was never the same again, and actually went off with her mother-in-law and was lost somewhere in history. So it's a very interesting story of the traditions that went into the children of Israel. Then, page over that is one you can do for a little bit of review for homework. And again, whether you have enough room on this page or you need to do it on your own page of paper. Number 1, the name of the covenant. And the first covenant was which one? In the Garden of Eden. And it was made with man. And at that point he wasn't called Adam, so it was made with man. And then you need to go through the words of the promises in the curse. So what was man promised in the Garden of Eden? Then the blood sacrifice, the seal, the foundations for the next covenant. Second covenant we covered is the one with Adam and Eve. And that was the Adamic covenant. And again, the words that were spoken in that covenant, the blood sacrifice, the seal, the foundations in that covenant for the next one. So again, this can be another 5,000 word essay for my class. Number 3 covenant was with Noah. And the 4th covenant was made with Abraham. So there are the first 4 covenants. If you want to take that apart, it makes a good little review of the covenants for you.
What do you mean by God's theme?
Theme? So the major threads that come through that covenant. Like with Noah, it was human government. Was also the 3 sons. So the theme, the Messiah, is through the theme. One of the themes, people of his own theme. In fact, at the beginning we talked about the major blocks of the covenant. So where did we find that? Yep, on page 2 of this session. Session 2. I just see my copy person made a mistake. This is supposed to be session 2 that we're on down at the bottom of the page. The little page numbers should be session 2. So the sacrificial system, judgment on Satan, the Messiah, to set limits on man's destructive abilities. Those are sort of the major themes that God brings down through each covenant. Okay, any other comments?
What was the name of the first covenant you said?
Edom, Edamic,
And then you got
with Adamic, Adam,
Noah and Abraham.
and Noah, and then Abraham.
Edamic.
So made in the Garden of Eden, Edamic.
E-D-E-N-I-C.
Yes, Edamic. I actually think, part of this is based on a study with Kevin Conner. And for those of you who don't know Kevin Conner, he's probably one of the best Bible scholars that was around. He's not probably doing as much these days as his son, but he was one of the founder pastors of Waverly Christian Fellowship. He did a nice thick book on the covenants, and Daniel and I, when we were at Bible school, we did the correspondence course for it. So some of the information has come from that. So he was very, very meticulous in every covenant has a sign, every covenant has a seal, every covenant has words, every covenant has a place, every covenant has, etc., 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 etc. So I think he made up some of these words. I don't know if you'll find them in a dictionary. Edamic covenant and Noetic covenant and... Sorry? Yes, like Noah. Yeah. Well, like I said, I think he made up some of the words. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Any other comments? So next week we're going to talk about Moses and the law, the schoolmaster covenant. We still got 5 more minutes. What shall we talk about? No other comments, questions?
So what's the workshop going to be on?
The workshop probably will be the new covenant with Jesus and the everlasting covenant. So whether we'll actually have a practical session, although like I said, what we are thinking about is either having creation evolutionists this one, or when we talk about the challenges to the Christian faith, where we actually talk about all the different cults and the different religions. So, yeah, next June is the challenges to the Christian faith.
Did I do that last year?
Probably so, Maria. Okay, how about I pray for... Question?
Yeah, no, just one observation.
Mm-hmm.
The gentleman that we had at church on Sunday
Yes.
made some interesting comments about
Yes.
if the Muslims are descendants.
I'll pray for you and then we'll stop for the night. Well, Father God, once again you have shown us that you have built precept upon precept, line upon line, and that, Lord God, you have never left your people unprotected and untaken care of. And Lord, even in the story of the great flood, you protected Noah and his family. So Lord, while we don't have all the answers, we're just thankful that you do and that you see the beginning from the end. So Lord, I ask a blessing on the people here tonight. Lord, continue to teach us your view of mankind. And Lord, we thank you that we were born in this time and in this age where we had a choice and where we can allow you to touch our heart and draw us closer to you, Lord. Continue to teach each one of us, Lord. In your precious name, amen.